Welcome to the Neuromodulation podcast, presented to you by the International Neuromodulation Society. Dive into the forefront of today's emerging neuromodulation techniques, insights, and ethical and clinical applications. Subscribe now to join the multidisciplinary collaboration of medical care providers, scientists, and engineers who are part of the global conversation that's shaping the future of healthcare. Welcome to today's episode of the Neuromodulation podcast, presented by the International Neuromodulation Society. I'm today's host, Mandy Soleil, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Robert Levy. Dr. Robert Levy earned his medical degree at Stanford University, where he also received his Ph.D. in neurosciences and completed a postdoctoral fellowship. He performed a second postdoctoral research fellowship and his residency in neurological surgery at the University of California, San Francisco, where his mentors included Dr. Howard Fields, Dr. Charles Wilson, and Dr. Yoshio Hosobuchi. He then moved to Northwestern University, where he rose to the level of tenured professor of neurological surgery, physiology, and radiation oncology at the Feinberg School of Medicine. During this period, he served as the acting chairman of the Department of Neurological Surgery. He was then recruited to serve as professor and chairman of the Department of Neurological Surgery and co-director of the UF Health Jacksonville Neuroscience Institute at the University of Florida College of Medicine in Jacksonville, Florida. He most recently served as the founding director of the Marcus Neuroscience Institute and director of the Harvey Sandler Center for Neurosurgery in Boca Raton, Florida. Dr. Levy has authored several textbooks and published over 350 peer-reviewed journal articles. He has been the recipient of many national and international honors and lifetime achievement awards, and has been listed in the best doctors in America. His current research involves novel applications of neurostimulation and targeted drug delivery to the brain, and he is assisted with the design and implementation of multiple new neuromodulation technologies and instruments. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Levy is the immediate past president of the INS, as well as the editor-in-chief of the INS's journal, Neuromodulation Technology at the Neural Interface, making him an excellent contributor to today's topic on what journal editors look for in a manuscript submission. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Levy today.
Thank you.
Pleased to have you here. So could you share a bit about your role as the editor of Neuromodulation? What got you inspired to take on this role of editor-in-chief with the journal? And why is the mission of the journal important to you?
Well, the journal is the educational organ of the International Neuromodulation Society, and I have dedicated my career to advancing research and education in the field of neuromodulation. When the opportunity came to become the editor-in-chief of the journal, I immediately accepted because it gave me the opportunity to not only improve the quality of the journal, but also the breadth and scope of the field of neuromodulation. I've now been editor for almost 15 years, and we have seen during that time not only the journal being accepted by the National Library of Medicine, but also a significant growth of its impact factor, of its page count, and most importantly, of the quality and breadth of the articles that we've published.
Great. Could you walk our listeners through the process of what it looks like to submit a manuscript to the journal?
You know, different journals have different criteria and different processes, but with our journal, because we're still relatively small in the world of journals, it's a very hands-on approach for us in terms of dealing with every submitted article. So our authors will begin by first checking the publication requirements that are posted online and available to everyone in terms of the length of the articles, in terms of the general categories that we are interested in, and other issues of that sort. Once they have checked against that and make sure that their article fits the requirements of the journal, there is then an online access port for them to submit the article online and complete the required paperwork that we have, ensuring the validity of the information that's presented in the articles, as well as confirming that all of the authors participated in the project as is required. Once the article is submitted through our electronic access system, it is given a document number and we are immediately notified. Our editorial team then immediately gets involved, and the first step is with our editorial manager, Mary Price, who reviews the manuscript, makes sure that it meets all the criteria that are required, and then queues it up for our regular editorial meetings. Those meetings are attended not only by Ms. Price, but also by me and Dr. Robert Foreman, who is my assistant editor. We then review the article to make sure it meets basic criteria and it's worth general consideration. And the overwhelming majority of articles are considered as such. And we then assign it to one of our section editors. As most of you know, neuromodulation is a very broad field, and it includes genitourinary neuromodulation, gastrointestinal neuromodulation, stimulation of the brain for movement disorders, spinal cord stimulation for pain, peripheral nerve stimulation for pain, and urinary dysfunction, and on down the list. And our journal serves the needs of all of that spectrum of neuromodulation. And so for each subject area, we have national and international experts who serve as our section editors. So we then assign the article to the appropriate section editor, and the section editor then assigns it to reviewers. The reviewers then get back to the section editor with their reviews. Between their reviews and the section editor's review, they make a recommendation on the manuscript. Again, Dr. Foreman and I sit down and review all of that information as well as the manuscript and decide whether the manuscript is acceptable. And few articles are acceptable without some degree of revision, whether it is requiring of revision but still considered for publication, or whether the article should be rejected. And even if rejected, some of the concepts that are proposed are sufficiently important for us to say the article is rejected, but if you take in mind all of the information we've provided you from the reviewers and you're willing to write what is a completely new manuscript, we will accept that new submission.
Makes sense. So what would you say the key components are for a well-prepared manuscript that makes your job a little easier?
I wish that our job was easier, but it's not, because it's a very hands-on process, as you can see. But there are key elements that are required of every paper. And this goes along the spectrum of anything from a case report or a technical note, all the way through a comprehensive case study of the sort as a randomized controlled trial or a large-scale real-world trial. First of all, every article requires a hypothesis. That is, just providing information is not of a great deal of value unless it's allowed to either prove or disprove the hypothesis. Second of all, the articles need to have a detailed report of the materials and methods that are used. One of the big problems with medical literature as it stands is that some publications don't provide sufficient information to allow the study to be replicated. And the whole process of science is the ability for others to replicate the results of submitters so that once the study has been replicated, people have some greater faith that it's real and of importance. In addition to the materials and methods, there has to be consideration of the appropriate statistics for evaluating the data that's presented. And unfortunately, one of the biggest problems that we see is the misuse of statistics that results in a lack of validation of the results. And so we have this problem occur frequently enough that we've recently recruited a section editor to review the biostatistics that are used in all submissions to make sure it's proper, and then also to recommend what alternate statistics might be more appropriate. Next, the results. In a clear and concise manner, we need the results spelled out. And then last of all, a conclusion that is supported by the data. That is, oftentimes people make wild conclusions based on very little data, and the data doesn't really support the conclusion. So it's important to think carefully about the implications of the data and use them to come to conclusions that they support. In addition, it is also helpful to go through a critique. And that critique involves what are the weaknesses of the article? What are problems that need to be addressed in future studies? Having some degree of introspection so that it's clear that you've thought through not only the potential important value of your article, but also of the potential issues when people try to read the article critically. There's a next step, and that is once one gets the review back and the results of the review come from me and Dr. Foreman, it's important not to despair if the results are not what you expected. We work very hard to get reviewers who provide a careful, comprehensive, and unbiased review. And to simply go point by point through that review and respond in a straightforward manner with no hostility. No hostility is intended. It's all trying to improve the quality of your article. But by addressing those points one by one, providing a cover letter that identifies your response to each of the points made by the reviewers, and last of all, making sure that you identify where in the text you have made those changes to address the reviewer's comments. That often makes the difference between rejection and acceptance of the manuscript. Last of all, it's important to recognize that we are not perfect. We work very hard, however, to be better than many of the large journals who have a very impersonal process. For example, journals like the New England Journal of Medicine are so large and they receive so many thousands of submissions that there is a team of non-expert, non-physicians who review all of the initial submissions. And in fact, 75% of the papers may never be seen by the eyes of a field expert or a physician. That's just the difficulty with that system. We don't do that. We look at every submission, we look at every review, and sometimes we can make mistakes. And the most important thing is communication. If you believe that you have gotten a review by someone who you know is biased, and we don't give the names of the reviewers, but sometimes it's obvious, or if a review seems to be unfair, or if the reviewer seemed not to understand what it was that you were trying to get across, let us know. And we again do a thorough evaluation of the times that people provide some feedback and concern about the quality of the review. 50% of those articles either have a new reviewer appointed or have another review process initiated to make sure that we are fair and unbiased. And ultimately, about 1 in 4 articles where we receive concerns, ultimately with revision, get accepted. So it is a real and valuable process to feedback if you think you have been treated unfairly.
As we look at evaluation criteria, do you have any commentary on the importance of originality or significance of the research findings in your evaluation process?
That, of course, is one of the most important things that we look for. Many years ago, when the quality of evidence required was much less than it is now, people would frequently publish, well, I did a series of 50 of these, and someone else would publish, I did a series of 50 of those. But those don't stand up under the current level of scientific rigor. So first of all, if something has been done before, if something has even been done many times, it is not of great value to us in the journal. And so we would recommend not submitting that, but doing something that is novel, original, or proves things in a way that is better than it has been proven before. Those are wide open to both evaluation and acceptance for the journal. But the originality is one of the critical factors that we address. Another one has to do with readability. And one of the big problems that we have seen as we have expanded to a true international journal is that non-native English speakers, whether they are Chinese or European or anywhere else in the world, often write in a way that is not comprehensible. Not because the idea is poor, not because they don't have an extreme degree of intelligence, just because they don't know the language. So I would recommend to everyone who is not a native English speaker to pass your manuscript through a medical writer who knows as their primary language English, to make sure that it doesn't get held up in the process and undergo review only to come back to you saying, we don't understand it, you need to rewrite it and then submit it again.
The next thing that's coming to mind for me is peer review. I think it's reasonable to argue that's a really essential part of the process of evaluating manuscripts. Can you speak to how the Neuromodulation Journal selects peer reviewers and what role they play in the process?
Well, peer review is the critical underpinning of all medical publications. And anything that doesn't undergo peer review is neither to be trusted, nor often does it even get through the National Library of Medicine and available for dissemination. So all major medical journals are critically dependent upon peer review. Now, if you think that our journal gets somewhere between 500 and 1,000 submissions a year, and that each manuscript requires a minimum of 3 completed reviews, and that we have to ask many, many more than 3 people in order to get 3 solid reviews, because we put a tremendous burden on our subject experts by asking them to review the volume of manuscripts that we have. And so it is not at all unreasonable for people to sometimes say that they're too busy, or they can't fulfill our time frame, or we've asked them, but they really feel it's outside of their expertise. And so we have to have a very large pool of peer reviewers. At first, it's very difficult. That is, identifying those people, looking at their publication history, looking at the journals they published, knowing their areas of expertise. But once you do this for a long time, you collect a book full of potential reviewers, of subject experts who have accepted to review manuscripts in the past and who have defined the areas of expertise that we have then gone through to ensure that they're good reviewers. In addition, it requires some degree of shepherding. That is, over time, we identify, for example, that some excellent reviewers are biased by the fact that they earn a significant amount of money from industry. We can't have that. So we get those people off of the review rolls. We also have people who are either biased or unfair for other reasons, and we get rid of them as reviewers. So employees of companies, people who have received significant amounts of money from industry, people who are otherwise conflicted are not allowed to review for the journal, and it's an aggressive ongoing process that we have to undertake to make sure that our reviewer pool is unbiased, fair, and expert in the field.
Do you have any recommendations on where authors would go if they feel that the reviewer they're communicating with has been unfair to them?
Well, that's what I'm here for. And so I would strongly recommend that if you have a review and you think it's unfair, or again, that the reviewer didn't understand it or was biased or is so committed to one company that they disfavor your paper because you're using another company, whatever that is, we have a very clear and formal review process, and it just begins with an email. And if you email the journal and tell us about it, that triggers a review process where we read the article again, we read the reviews, we interpret the reviews with the feedback that we have from reviews of other papers and decide, one, whether to say, I'm sorry, it was legitimate and we thank you for submission, but it's not acceptable. Or we may say that review was flawed. We're going to throw out that review. We're going to appoint a new unbiased reviewer and make sure that your manuscript gets a fair and valid review.
So I want to shift us over to start thinking about some of the ethical considerations of manuscript submission processes. But before we move on, do you have any other tidbits of advice for authors who are communicating with you guys in this process, in particular to either move things along more seamlessly or to improve the outcome?
I think that communication is the most important factor. We read every email that we get. We consider every suggestion that our authors have. Sometimes we tell you something that feels good and is what you want to hear. Sometimes we don't, but we work very hard to ensure that we are fair, unbiased, and give everyone the same consideration, regardless of whether it's your first journal submission or whether or not it's someone who has published hundreds of articles. Everyone is treated the same.
Great. So you've spoken a lot about the ethics of the journal itself, but what about in the work that authors are submitting? Can you share how the journal navigates issues around plagiarism, data fabrication, conflicts of interest, any other ethical concerns that you can think of?
That is the largely unseen but greatest challenge that we have. It has been made easier by having a lot of computer-based systems that allow us to relatively quickly determine whether an article has been published before, what % of an article reflects another already published article, and based upon that, we not infrequently will go to authors and say, this manuscript has an 80% overlap with this manuscript that's already been published in another journal. Please justify that this is truly a unique manuscript. Furthermore, at the beginning of the submission, there are a lot of papers that need to be signed that are the same thing legally as an affidavit. And we don't even review articles until all of those boxes are checked off. And that means confirming that all of the authors participated and how they participated in the manuscript generation, and revealing what degree of support you might have gotten from industry or some non-academic source in terms of any process in the manuscript, whether it's using a medical writer, whether it is statistical support, whether or not the manuscript was paid for in any way by industry. All of these are critical variables, and even before Mary Price sends on a manuscript to me, that has already been vetted to make sure that people have ensured that those potential ethical problems have been avoided.
And sometimes these problems aren't necessarily even intentional. So I'm curious, there's been a lot of buzz in the neuromodulation industry recently about studies that may have flawed methodologies in their findings around neuromodulation therapies. Would you like to expound on that and perhaps address its impact on the field?
Well, I think that that's an interesting problem because the assumption is, or has always been, that industry-sponsored studies are all by their very nature not only biased, but poorly designed and always in favor of industry. Well, I don't believe that. And I don't believe that for several reasons. First of all, much of what is done is not published because of negative results. That is, we're happy to publish an article, and several of our articles are published with negative results, unlike many other medical journals. But if a company has money invested in a product and it doesn't work, they are unlikely to publish it. And where that creates a problem is the fact that what we see from industry are all studies, for the most part, that have been either moderately or completely successful. So the outside critique is all this literature is positive, it must be biased, whereas there are a whole bunch of studies that are never published that people don't see to balance it out. Furthermore, almost all of the industry studies require significant levels of review on the part of the FDA. And having been to the FDA many, many times over my career, I can tell you that they perform a rigorous and careful review. And if something is poorly designed, if something is unsafe for patients, if something, if performed, won't provide reliable conclusions, the FDA doesn't allow that study to be done. And therefore, it is often the case, because the studies have gone through rigorous FDA review and proper biostatistical consultation, the industry-sponsored studies may in fact be of a higher degree of quality than those produced by independent, non-supported investigators. And so, while I think that there is always consideration of these potential flaws within studies, the fact that studies undergo, for the most part, FDA review prior to them getting to the point of publication, and the fact that we have great confidence in the quality of our reviewers, that anything that should somehow get by the FDA is picked up by our reviewers, and that is reflected in the fact that our rejection rate is about 70%. That is, only 3 out of 10 submitted articles get accepted and published, and that's a way of confirming the selectivity and the quality of what we publish.
High quality research isn't the only piece of the puzzle here. We also need to present the research in a way that reflects the data accurately and clearly. I'm curious, do you have any recommendations for authors around how to create high quality figures and data presentation that will be consumable by the public and that would merit being published in a journal like Neuromodulation?
I underwent a tremendous learning experience several years ago about this. There is a very instructive book called How to Tell Stories with Data
Mm.
that addresses this area in particular. I have no commercial ties or financial interest in either the author or the book, but I would strongly recommend that everybody in a scientific field read that book because it's full of very useful bits of information that allow clarity and focus when it comes to using data to present either PowerPoint presentations or to create graphs and figures for publication that are much more expressive. One of the problems that we all have is that we want to tell everybody every bit of work we did because we've done a tremendous amount of work. And as a result, many people will create figures or tables that have so much information that they aren't even interpretable. And this is one way to learn to be more efficient with creating that information so it's understandable not only to the reviewers, but the people who will be reading the articles.
What about supplemental materials? Can you share your feedback on what authors should consider when determining whether or not they should include those materials?
Supplemental materials is a relatively new phenomenon in medical publishing. The reason it came about is that the field is trying to provide as much information as possible that allows people to fully understand and potentially replicate the study, but at the same time have the manuscript both readable and clear, and to limit the page count that we need to print for every journal. It's expensive. So with supplemental materials, there are ways of moving that data from the actual printed article, usually to an online source that is easily referable. The process by which you determine what should or should be included in the manuscript itself versus supplemental material is difficult. And I, in fact, review for some authors all of their data because they want outside eyes to look at it and help them with what is really key for their story and what is just supportive. I would recommend, one, having a knowledgeable but independent second party review the data set and say, this is important to include, but it's supplemental, or if you don't include this, people won't understand how the results led to your conclusion. The process that I would do myself and that someone else can also help you with is exactly that. That is, identify what data is critical to be considered in the overall results to be able to support the conclusion that you're making, and what is supplementary to that, and therefore obviously would go into a supplemental site, which, as I mentioned, is usually online.
You mentioned that publishing journals is expensive. I'm curious if you can expound on the journal's perspective regarding open access. The Neuromodulation Journal has a hybrid model. Could you explain why that is and what that means for our listeners who might not be aware?
Well, first of all, you mentioned the expense of publishing, and unfortunately, medical publishing is a business, and we have to be aware of the costs and the risk benefits of every expenditure that we make. One of the things that we considered, for example, was whether or not this should be an online journal. In fact, we had a user poll that was conducted for us by the publisher, and one of the interesting findings was fully 75% of INS members and journal subscribers wanted the print version. And I also like the look and feel of a journal, so it didn't take much to convince me that we need to continue that. Furthermore, you mentioned open access, and many of our viewers may not be aware of what that actually means. So some journals are only open access, which means that anyone, either online or by request, can have access to the full text of an article. And the way that's supported is by charging the people who submit the articles money in order to accomplish that. And journals have a cost that ranges in the thousands of dollars. Our current journal charges around $3,500 for an open access article, which allows people to disseminate freely the articles that are published, as opposed to making people either pay for the article or subscribe to the journal to have access to it. Some journals have no open access and simply say, if you want our content, you need to buy a subscription or pay for each article that you download. And then there is us, Neuromodulation, which has a mixed model. Many organizations require that if their support was used in order for you to create your article, that they require you to use open access. And many times they will actually include in their support money to pay for open access. That's an easy one. If you aren't in a situation like that, then there's a significant conflict. Do I pay the $3,500 that is required to be able to have everyone have access to my article right away? Or is just getting it out there sufficient, because if people really want it, they'll either pay for it, or we think a better solution is to simply subscribe to the journal. So it's an evolving area. Some of the contracts that publishers enter into with countries or groups of countries require them to provide them open access at either a lower cost or some different process. And we are obliged to follow whatever policy our publisher makes for us and for the rest of their journals. But it changes over time, and it's something that we all need to pay attention to. I would guess that things are going to look very much different 5 years from now, but we'll go through that process with you.
So, different journals have different models, but also different guidelines and expectations for submissions. Can you share with listeners where they might go to find the neuromodulation journal's guidelines so that they can consider that as they're pursuing their research studies?
I think that that's very important, and it's very helpful for someone to check before they do a study, if they're considering publication in any journal, including neuromodulation, to see what their requirements are, so you don't do a lot of work and then find out it's outside the scope or didn't follow the rules of any given journal. For us, we believe we've made that very easy. The website neuromodulation.com is the INS website, and when you enter that information and log on to that website, there is a picture of the journal, and if you just follow the prompts to the journal, you will right away be directed to a drop-down list that includes a list of all of the required features for an article to be considered by the journal.
Great. What about mistakes that are made or misconceptions that authors have as they're submitting to the journal? Do any come to mind?
Well, occasionally we get post hoc requests to change something in the manuscript.
Mm.
Sometimes we want to add an author that we forgot to include before, or other times this data has not been supported and we want to remove it from the journal. If we get that request early enough in the publication process, it is something that we can easily correct. We have to have you vouch for the accuracy of the information that you provide, but then we can do those changes easily. If the manuscript, however, already appears online or is being processed for actual printing, the only way to change something like that is to publish what is called a corrigendum. That is, on a page in the journal saying exactly that. The authors have withdrawn the following information, or we are withdrawing the following paper, or they need to change this phrase to that phrase. It is very cumbersome. And sometimes it requires, if there are significant enough changes, to actually withdraw the article, which is not something anyone wants to have available when they look at their publication history. So the best thing, of course, is to be rigorous from the start. But if you identify an error, let us know right away so that we can correct it without having to go through this onerous process.
How do you see the process of submitting manuscripts to journals like Neuromodulation evolving in the future? And are there any technological advancements that we should be aware of that you expect to come?
Well, certainly the biggest change has already occurred. And the fact that all of this stuff is done online instead of with real paper makes the process much easier and much more efficient for everyone. In the future, one of the big things that we are confronting now is the use of AI in the creation of manuscripts. So one might say, well, we'll just rule out all use of AI. That's very difficult and doesn't necessarily add any strength to the validity of the articles that are published. So the policy that we use in terms of the use of ChatGPT or other similar AI tools is that, one, that the author verifies that they have reviewed that content in detail and will vouch for its accuracy. And two, that the use of ChatGPT or AI be clearly specified within the article. Those kind of things are going to be the kind of future challenges that we have. Another challenge that's facing the field is the fact that the interests of the societies or organizations that publish journals are starting to diverge from the interests of the companies that publish them. So, for example, and I won't use any specific names of companies here, but a lot of companies have moved to a model where they much prefer the volume of articles published instead of the quality of the articles. And so while most or many journals have been clearly focused on their impact factor, which reflects the quality of the manuscripts that they publish, many publishers don't care about impact factor anymore. They don't care about the rejection rate. In fact, the more articles that they publish feeds their system, which is a financially based system. And so making sure that dinosaurs like me still have a strong voice in the future about insisting on quality and reliability and reproducibility and integrity in what they publish, as opposed to losing that where the end reader can easily be misled based upon the lack of quality as we've described before.
For our listeners who are newer to the manuscript world, could you describe what an impact factor is?
The impact factor has in fact changed. It was originally a product that Thomson Reuters created many years ago, and they owned this impact factor, and they did calculations every year for journals. They look at the prior 2 years, and for each journal, they look at the total number of articles that were published and the number of citations that were made to those articles during that 2-year period. So if you had citations of 100 of your papers over the last year, and those papers having been published in the prior 2 years, and you'd published 1,000 articles, your impact factor would be 0.1. And it's a very simple mathematic calculation, but it's one that historically has been felt to be reflective of the quality of a journal. That product was purchased by another company a few years ago, and they have tweaked the model a little bit where certain publications are considered as part of the calculation, others are not, but it's basically the same thing. And so every journal that is a peer-reviewed journal looks every year for their impact factor as feedback in terms of the quality of their writing and publishing. Interestingly, there is a strong publication submission bias based upon impact factors. So if you have a journal that has an impact factor of 10, that is going to be one that people will submit to, usually much more than a journal that has an impact of 1. And so it influences the volume of manuscripts and the quality of manuscripts that the journal receives. And also, it is something that in many countries, reimbursement is tied to the amount of the impact factor for a given journal. So in some Asian countries, for example, people can receive financial bonuses from the government, and those bonuses are a bigger percentage of a person's salary based upon the impact factor of the journal where they've been published.
I want to give one opportunity for listeners to peer behind the veil a bit. I'd love to get your feedback on whether or not there are any topics or topic areas that you'd be most excited to welcome in submissions in the years to come. And then any closing tips or guidance you have for those looking to submit manuscripts to the journal.
First of all, I would say that neuromodulation is a very broad field. And so to say that this topic is more important than that topic really doesn't serve our readership well. For example, there has been a great move toward non-invasive neuromodulation that went from a period of having no publications in that area to the point where non-invasive stimulation makes up 20 to 25% of the papers that we publish. And so things like TMS or TDCS have now a big role in the influence of what we receive and also what we publish. So less important than the topic. And as I mentioned, it's such a broad area. I'm equally excited by high quality papers in non-invasive neuromodulation and genitourinary modulation, as I am with the traditions like chronic pain therapy or the treatment of movement disorders. Similar to the non-invasive field, we have significantly increased our submissions in the area of neurostimulation for epilepsy. It's an area where we didn't get much traction several years ago. However, with the help of our meetings and our webinars, we are now developing a significant presence in the neuromodulation for epilepsy area. So I would actually invert what you said in that there isn't a single area where we specifically want more submissions. However, what we really want to do is increase the quality of what we publish. So in the old days, publishing a retrospective series, I did 100 of these, and looking back, this is the information that I've developed. That's no longer the coin of the realm. There is very little validity that comes as a result of publishing such a paper and using the Oxford or the Cochrane grading system in terms of the quality of evidence. Those retrospective studies are graded grade 3, for example, and for any government or insurance decision-making, they seldom consider anything lower than grade 2 information. So it really isn't used for anything that has a significant impact on our medical practice or our insurance systems or our governments. So what are the things that we will be looking for more in the future? Randomized controlled trials are the coin of the realm. They remain, even though they have been assaulted as not being reflective of the general population. Randomized controlled trials are always high on our list. Second of all, properly done real-world studies. That is, one can look back on a retrospective way and say, but these were all done by regular doctors, so it's a real-world study. That doesn't meet muster. However, there are formal definitions of real-world studies, the kind of information collection hygiene that must be performed to make them valid, and the big statistics that are used to draw conclusions for them. And so real, properly done real-world studies are equally valuable as randomized controlled trials. Other than that, we have a hope that most of what we publish reflects novel and creative thinking. And so I often get manuscripts that either report negative results or are highly theoretical. But if we read them and identify them as potentially guiding the field in a new direction, those are always the most important articles. I don't want to discourage people from not submitting their articles to the journal, because if there is novel information, if the collection of data that you have performed allows you to make conclusions that we can't make or haven't been able to make in the past, that's still of value. But I think we're going to see more and more in the future a demand for properly done real-world trials, randomized controlled trials, and new creative thinking.
Well, for any listeners who are authors potentially submitting manuscripts to the journal, I apologize if I got you too excited about getting topic ideas, but I think it speaks to the credibility and the ethical considerations of the journal. So I love the response that you provided there. And with that, I want to thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, and it's certainly a pleasure to be able to draw people to the journal. And the one closing comment that I would have is to simply say communication is key. If you have questions, if you have problems, if you have any issues at all, please contact us so we can respond, give you the information you need, and ultimately get the highest quality papers in our journal.
And I welcome listeners to take a moment to subscribe to make sure you get notified when the next episode releases. Thank you.